the greatest experience of all. All right, this is Lee Baker.
How you doing?
And Lee, I want you to introduce yourself and let the audience know who you are.
You bet. Lee Baker, former bishop of the Mililani 2nd Ward, Mililani, Hawaii. Member of the church for 32 years. I was ordained a high priest by Charles P. Warnick, who was a good friend of Thomas S. Monson. So when I was a member of the church, there was one person between me and the current prophet of the church. Loved our time in the church. Read the doctrine, though, and found out that it wasn't biblical. And it was mostly my wife and I who studied the scriptures and left the church 6 years ago. And I've been working with Alan here, great guy, for about a year electronically, emails back and forth on different questions and that. And we just had an opportunity to come out to his house here in Utah and appreciate the invitation.
All right. And Alan, give me an idea for the audience who you are, what kind of positions have you had in the LDS church, and why don't you share a little more about that?
Yes, Alan Richardson. I've taught Sunday school, priesthood, been a scoutmaster, cub master, enjoyed all aspects of the church service. I've been in a bishopric and high council and enjoyed my activity in the church. It's given me some wonderful experiences and enjoy sharing it with others. I would like to formally invite Lee to find his way back. He's a lost sheep, and feel bad for him, but there's always repentance and forgiveness.
And hope.
Okay, so I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting conversation that we're going to have. All right, well, you have a number of questions that you're going to be talking about. Why don't we start with those questions?
Okay, and I thought what I'd do, Alan, is how about if I describe what I remember as a member of the church, a high priest, and a bishop, and if I make a mistake, if you interrupt me at any time rather than me putting words in your mouth, I'll describe to you what I believed, and if you have any issue, just let me know. And,
sure. Okay,
so we'll start out with the purpose and function of the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. And as I understand it, and taught it to my children, the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible was put in to correct, to bring back to order the things that the scribes, the priests, the Pharisees, and throughout thousands of years of translations that have been lost, the plain and precious truths of the Bible, and corrections, even sometimes just small corrections. So the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, the purpose of that is to bring the Bible back into conformity, back into an order as close as possible through the power and authority of the priesthood and the inspiration of God to what the Bible should have been. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Okay. So the purpose of the Joseph Smith translation is to correct the Bible. So the Joseph Smith translation in the LDS scriptures actually has more authority, is more correct than the King James version of the Bible. We'd agree on that.
Yes, so we would agree.
Okay. And the one question that I'd like to focus on that bothered me when I was actually substitute teaching for Institute. Had a good friend in Washington, D.C. that went on vacation, and I covered for him in Institute. And in the lesson that I was giving, I noticed that the Joseph Smith translation in Genesis chapter 17 was rather unique in that it corrects the very first covenant between God and Abraham. So I reviewed, and let me put this out and see if you agree with this. As far as Abraham and Moses are concerned, their relationship with God was unique. Maybe only unique, if you would, from a Mormon perspective, in comparison to Joseph Smith. Direct communication, daily communication. God worked with Abraham and Moses quite a bit, right? We would assume that God could communicate directly to Moses, and certainly Abraham. Abraham represents the father of three monotheistic religions. No one questions either the authority, the integrity, the intent, or the accuracy of Abraham, Father Abraham. And Genesis is about 17, Genesis chapter 17, is about the very first covenant ever between God and mankind, and that is the covenant of circumcision. So after Abraham comes out of Ur, and he comes into a city called, where did he come? It doesn't not Shechem, but he he makes a covenant with Abraham, and he says that all your males 8 years of old, whether they're a slave or born in your house, should be circumcised. And that is the covenant between God and Abraham, correct? Okay. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to read the correction that Joseph Smith did. And again, this is the canonized version of the King James Bible, and this is the Joseph Smith translation. And Alan, would you want me to read that, or I'll
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll read it. So here it is. This is chapter 17, verse 11 of the corrected version of the King James Bible. So we're reading from the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, specifically the 17th chapter of Genesis, 11th verse. And this is the correction of what the Bible transcribers got wrong. It says, "And I will establish a covenant of circumcision with thee, and it shall be my covenant between me and thee, and thy seed after me, in their generations, that thou mayest know forever that children are not accountable before me until they are 8 years old." So the difference between the Genesis of the King James Bible and the Genesis of the Joseph Smith Bible is not circumcision. He never references baptism. The difference is he changes the age requirement from 8 days to 8 years. And I'd like to just kind of pass that and see if you would agree with that is the primary event that Joseph Smith changes. And you can look into Genesis, the original, which the Mormon Church has not changed in the King James Bible. The corrections are all in the Joseph Smith translation.
I take your word for it.
Okay.
My answer is, first of all, not having been told what our subject matter is, I'll just speak from general knowledge, since I had no way to prepare. Joseph Smith translation was not perfect. He said himself, and I don't have the exact reference at hand, where he said, "I need to go through it again. There are some glitches, and I need to fix it." I look at circumcision as a type of baptism, symbolically, figuratively speaking. I see it as a cleansing. I see both similarities in both. We know that there was baptism in the Old Testament times, according to what Paul said in Corinthians, that people were baptized under the cloud, and they it speaks of the rock, which was Christ, where Moses was involved in the living water. But I would like to comment on some other aspects of the Joseph Smith translation.
Well, I actually haven't asked the actual question. We're just kind of setting the table right now on whether or not that was an accurate statement.
Okay.
Okay, so here's the question, is that if Joseph Smith was correct in changing 8 days to 8 years in the King James Version of the Bible, that means that the Mormon Church, and the Mormon Church has had the opportunity to change anything they've wanted. They've changed the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants up until 2003. So almost every year that there's a reprint of the Scriptures, there's also a change of the Scriptures. This has never been changed. So this change happened in 1843. And it has never been changed. It has been canonized by the church. But here's the impact of that potential change that, to me, speaks to the fact that Joseph Smith could not have been a prophet, because if it was true that Abraham wrote it, that Moses wrote this wrong, the very first covenant between God and man, and it happens to be circumcision, and he did it wrong, and Moses, who wrote Genesis, wrote it wrong. That means Isaac, Jacob, every prophet of the Old Testament, to include Jesus Christ himself, who is referenced 3 times in the New Testament, did it wrong. So the potential here is that if Joseph Smith got this correction wrong, that means that Joseph Smith cannot be a prophet, or it means that God the Father watched his entire lineage of priesthood from Abraham, Moses, Moses, Isaac, Jacob, and even his son, Jesus Christ, do the most important, the very first covenant of circumcision completely wrong. Every Jew on the planet, every prophet on the planet did it wrong, and God the Father in heaven thought, well, I will wait to fix this with my best prophet, Joseph Smith, in the year 1843. He will fix this when it will have absolutely no impact on any human being. So if the covenant of circumcision was done incorrectly, as Joseph Smith claims, then that means there's 4,500 years of God's people doing his very first and most important covenant entirely wrong. So in the shadow of a temple, it's very important to understand the importance of that potential mistake. It's not just an error, it's the fact that the covenant people have been known as the covenant people based on the covenant of circumcision. Now, the key is that this phrase next to the semicolon, so that ye may know, is used 5 other times in the Bible, approved by Joseph Smith, to bring, because as we all know, going to high school, the use of a semicolon that Joseph Smith correctly used is to bring 2 independent clauses closer together, not further apart. So he never says baptism. The word baptism, Alan, is not in the Old Testament anywhere. Never. Not once. Not the philosophy, not the principle, not the shadow, and certainly not the word of baptism. Okay. Although it is used to describe what the circumcision was. So that's the basic question, is did Joseph Smith get it right, which means all the prophets got it wrong?
Very good point. So what is your opinion on that?
First of all, I don't mind you cutting me off on my last statement, and you're way ahead of me on time, but that's fine. First of all, Joseph Smith, as I said before, said that the translation wasn't perfect, and secondly, he said in Doctrine and Covenants, spoke of translations where he said, I might have rendered a plainer translation. We know that prophets aren't absolutely perfect. I've done research on all the prophets of the Bible, and all of them made significant errors in the writing. I also would like to remind all of you that the as I said before, the translation wasn't finished. Brigham Young made the statement that there's no way a mortal translation can be made from a heavenly message. There will always be errors, there will always be mistakes. I'm not sure, I'm not convinced that there was any mistake involved in what Joseph Smith said in the inspired translation. I really believe that it's okay as is. It's the way we read it that can sometimes cause misunderstandings, interpretation, perspective. Lee says that no baptism is mentioned, but as I said before in the Corinthians, it refers back to the Old Testament, saying the people were indeed baptized. The Old Testament speaks of washings, which is the idea behind baptism. It's a type of washing. So let's not forget the concepts that are given to us in the New Testament and in the Old Testament, the reference to washings and cleansings. So let's not jump ahead of ourselves in assuming that there's any mistake there. Not that he could not have made a mistake. As I said before, we see mistakes in the scriptures. I have a list of things that need to be revised in the Book of Mormon and Doctrine and Covenants. That's fine. We're not going to get a perfect translation as long as we have mortal men writing a heavenly message.
So the point is that through the 185 years of the church, there has never been a correct version of any of the scriptures. If the Book of Mormon has been corrected, if the Doctrine and Covenants has been corrected, and if the Bible has been corrected through the 185-year history of the church, then what you're saying is that there is no truly correct version of any of the scriptures.
And you really can't trust the Word of God if
all
God
three
is making
have been
mistakes
changed.
constantly.
2013 was the new version of the Book of Mormon.
The Book of Mormon was not said to be perfect. It's most correct, the most correct, but it doesn't say it. There's not a superlative there, and so we need to keep in mind that what's correct for one period of time is not correct for another period of time. For instance, the word wonderful in the Book of Mormon. We had some wonderful wars, wonderful contentions. The word wonderful meant something that was very awful.
So,
and let me finish. The word awful used to mean something wonderful. Those two words have changed. The language changes. I have a master's degree in English, which says that the word awful, which means awe-inspiring, awesome, the word meaning can change. So we can't have that's just one short, quick example. Wonderful now means something with a positive message.
but as wonderful was not used in Genesis 17:11.
I'm not saying it was. I'm not saying it was.
That the 8 days or 8 years is accurate.
I'm saying we don't have to say that it's accurate. We don't have to say that we are the final authority on what it means. I'm saying that there's a matter of perspective and interpretation that is involved. But I would say that using the word wonderful and awful was only examples of how thousands of words change their meaning over time. And I am sure, I'm confident that all the scriptures will be changed. We are, as the language changes, and it will change as over time. Words change their meanings, and so we can't be dogmatic about this. We can't be authoritative. We can't jump to conclusions. What it speaks to me is that yes. What it speaks to me is that baptism is very similar to circumcision.
All right. You know, I also want to mention something. Alan was referring to those who are the Jews thousands of years ago, that there were similarities from baptism to ritual washings. I want to let you know, Alan, I've been in Israel. I was there 3 months ago, and there was a pool that both women and men, they just went in there, and it could be dirty water, but they went in there. It was really before the temple, when they went to the temple grounds, and they would just wash themselves because they felt like water would make them, cleaner. To prepare themselves before God, but they also had this water, the water inside their homes, a little, pot, and they would do the same thing. So it was not a baptism, form of baptism. It was just more of ritual washings. Okay, I don't know if you knew that or not.
Yes, I knew that. Circumcision was described in the Old Testament as being an everlasting covenant. I don't know if of any churches that require as part of their doctrine continuation of circumcision, but it was described in the Old Testament as an everlasting covenant.
Okay, great. Did you want to say any further on this, or do you want to go to the next question?
No, I think that we probably...
Okay,
yeah,
great.
I'm okay with that. Okay. And the second question I have, Alan, is more of a, in the past, because I understand and know what you mean about mistakes or things to be corrected, but it has bothered me when I was in the church, and even more so now that I'm out of the church, is that there are so many doctrines to be corrected, and so many errors to be corrected for a church that says we're the only true church on the earth, to continue to have kind of a floating doctrine and a floating set of canonized scriptures is somewhat unique. And I think it's been getting closer and closer to the actual one, but I now have a question about a specific doctrine, and that would be, I'll let you hold this, David, is Doctrine and Covenants section 101 verse 4, which was printed in 1835, and it stayed in print from 1835 to 1876. So that's nearly 80 years. And in that period of time, that was the height of polygamy, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints made this statement not only in print, but boldly to the Congress of the United States. It said, "Inasmuch as this Church of Christ has been reproached with the crime of fornication and polygamy, we declare that we believe that one man should have one wife and one woman one husband, except in the case of death, when either is at liberty to marry again. Now, that is in both the Doctrine and Covenants, 1835 version, and it's in the current history of the church. The point is how, in any frame of reference, is that not a bold lie? Because the church did, in fact, practice polygamy between 1835 and 1876. John Taylor, the third prophet of the church, actually used this reference on a flyer in England in his mission to convert over 350 families, convincing them that the church did not practice polygamy when he himself had 8 wives. When he made that statement, converted these people from England, brought them to Salt Lake, and then surprise, surprise, they did, in fact, participate in polygamy. That is the question number 2, is how, in statements after statements about the church and the prophet Joseph Smith, here's a statement that says that the prophet Joseph Smith was incapable of lying or deceitfulness. That's in a manual that the church says that they spent years on researching the accuracy of every statement, every line. So in the past, on the very first question, when you said that there are things to be corrected, and an ensign, a conference ensign, the church spent time saying when they put the manuals together by committee that they spend a great deal of time making sure that it's accurate. So the flexibility of things still need to be corrected, I don't buy as either a former Mormon or as a current Christian. But the basic question is, how can the statement about we do not practice polygamy not be a lie?
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Very good point. Okay. There's 3 answers to that. Number 1, they weren't practicing polygamy. They were practicing polygyny.
Could you define
Yeah,
that?
what's the difference?
Polygyny is where a man has more than one wife. Secondly, we know that God had a hand in polygamy. We in the Old Testament we read that God gave David his wives, and he says, "I would have given you more." So we know that God is involved in the practice. The third point.
If I might correct that.
Oh, excuse me.
Okay. No, just you know,
Yes.
is a correction. I'm not talking about polygamy as a practice. Whether or not it's right or wrong. Taking another man's wife is not polygamy. That is definitely against the Bible. Taking sisters, taking mothers and daughters is entirely different. What I'm asking about is how can a church make a statement that we're not doing something, not the definition of what that is, but the fact that they're doing polygamy, polygyny, bigamy, whatever it is, and convincing people that they're not the historical definition.
Well, as a church, they weren't doing these things. You've heard the percentages before, that there was maybe 3% that were involved. I think if we realize that it was an exception rather than a rule. Also, we need to remember that, and I know that Lee has had a lot to say about lies. There's many references in the scriptures where a lie is okay. Paul said in Romans chapter 3, he says, I lie for the benefit of the kingdom of God.
Could you quote that for me, please?
I said Romans chapter 3, verse 7, I believe. Again, I have not received any notice on what these discussions...
So, but these are the same subjects you have been speaking of for over a year. There's not a new one here yet.
In the Old Testament, in the 2 Kings, we have an account of God asking for, holding a council and asking for a lying spirit to go and deceive some people. So here again, the lying is not the unpardonable sin. I think it's sometimes...
So should it be a basis for a church?
I didn't say it was supposed to be a basis, and I don't think it was the basis, of course. But we can make much ado about lies and or miscommunications. But as we see it, the precedent in the Bible, I don't think our time is being spent effectively on talking about a practice that was approved and done in the Bible.
Okay, first off, it was never approved or done in the Bible. Never. So we need to qualify that. This is worth the rest of the day. If you can show me in the Bible, because the Bible actually speaks about that you cannot take a man's wife, which Joseph did, and a sister of another woman, and a mother and daughter. So if we scratch out polygamy entirely, can you explain to me why Joseph Smith married the women of other men?
Okay, again, there's a misunderstanding here. There's a difference between marrying and sealing. There were women that were sealed, but I don't think Lee or most critics don't differentiate between people that were sealed as sons and daughters and those who were sealed or married as wives. We have, in order to clarify, we since there were men that were sealed to Joseph Smith, some scholars, some critics have said, well, Joseph Smith was gay. No, these men were sealed. Joseph Smith believed in the importance of being sealed, children being sealed to parents. And some of the converts had been disowned, and so he said, you can be sealed to me. And some were sealed to some of the other leading brethren, Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, and others. As far as taking other men's wives, those were for eternity. Some of the husbands, I can think of 2 or 3 examples of husbands escorting their wives, husbands who are inactive or not members, who liked Joseph Smith and says, I don't mind if you seal my wife to you for eternity. They weren't for the mortal present. Also, we have a case of a prophet in the Bible who took another man's wife. David, who is described as a prophet in Acts chapter 2, and also as described as a patriarch, took Phaltiel's wife, and Phaltiel was weeping about it. And I don't think that case was a situation of a daughter being sealed to a father.
So mothers,
father figure.
Show me in the Bible where mothers and daughters were sealed.
All right.
Okay.
Okay, I think certainly you shared your views on that. Okay. I think the audience is seeing the differences here.
Okay.
Do you want to say any last, like a minute of why any further thing about this lying concept and the differences in the old Doctrine and Covenants?
Right. Okay. So
one last thing.
You bet. Well,
just the audience so they can understand.
Okay. Well, no, I appreciate the discussion and the counterpoints that Alan had. My basic question is simply this: without a gymnastic event in English, and I appreciate the fact that you have a degree in English, when a wife of another man in her diary says that she had carnal knowledge with Joseph Smith, I don't believe that those events were recorded as such and justified by the First Presidency, so you and I could have a discussion on your front lawn. So I'll go with the First Presidency's view in their essay, and that is that Joseph Smith took the wives of other men, and they didn't describe whether it was for time or eternity or not, and that the women also referenced in their diaries that they did have sexual relations, some of them did, with Joseph Smith. But the point is, hundreds of members have been lied to if the practice with any description of polygamy, polyandry, that when the church says we do not do that. The basic question was, how can a church say we do not use that doctrine, and they really did? That was the question.
Yeah.
And I will just summarize by saying, generally speaking, that was the rule. Again, the practice of doing those things was the exception rather than the rule. Also, we agree that there were mistakes. We don't hold the prophets, modern prophets, to a higher level of perfection than we do the Old Testament prophets. As I've studied the Old Testament and the Bible, and as I've said to Lee before, we're either going to have to throw out the Bible or return to Mormonism or be a hypocrite, because the Bible has all of the problems that Mormonism has. We don't expect perfection out of the Mormon leaders. It would be nice if they were all perfect. We don't expect them to be perfect.
All right. And thank you. Okay, so I finished with that. My last question is this, Alan, and it actually ties into your last statement where you say, which is true, that Joseph Smith was just a man. He wasn't perfect. My point is that I believe that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints actively deceives its members into completely the other view. Now, we can sit here and say that Joseph Smith was not perfect, and we knew that he made mistakes. The difference is that the brethren of the church, the current leadership of the church, wants us to believe entirely different about Joseph Smith. So what my last question is, these are documents, obviously, that I used as a bishop, active in the Mormon church. This is my last priesthood manual. I'm sure you have this in your house. And this manual was good for 2 years. It was about the lifetimes and teachings of Joseph Smith. And it was such a move forward for the church that they spent time in the ensign, this ensign, which is January 2008, and this is the year that I left the church, and it talks about the manual that they put together. Now, just let me read one quote about the manual. And the manual says, his teachings were carefully studied, authenticated, and compiled. The compilation was then approved by the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12. Here's the point. That doesn't give you the ability to circumvent a statement from the First Presidency. They said, each statement, let me repeat that, each statement in teachings of the presidents of the church, Joseph Smith, was thoroughly researched for accuracy. Extensive and painstaking efforts was extended to check the original source. So all we're saying is that the church went out of its way to say that this book is accurate. So although we've given the past prophets some leeway because they were just human beings, in the history of the church, Joseph Smith says that he did not practice polygamy. Joseph Smith never taught from the Book of Mormon, and he never condoned polygamy. Every opportunity he said he did not practice polygamy. Yet in the book that we're just told is the most accurate from the First Presidency of the church, on page 499, I read this in Washington, D.C., chapter 43, out loud to my priesthood group, and it says, I know that by nature he, Joseph Smith, was incapable of lying and deceitfulness. How could that statement be in this book if this book has just been justified by the First Presidency, saying that this is a correct book? We spend a lot of time to make sure. So you're telling me, on one hand, that we know that the prophets, let's say specifically Joseph Smith, was just a human being. He made mistakes. What bothers me is that the men 64 miles from this location right here are telling the rest of the world that's not true, that Joseph Smith was an honorable man, that Joseph Smith was incapable of lying. So it's the brethren of today that are bothering me when they're trying to cover up so deeply. So you have a great wide gap for Joseph Smith. What I'm saying is that the First Presidency of the church does not.
Well, I don't know how involved the leadership of the church is in historical details. I know that they are good administrators. I don't know if they have degrees in historical research. But again, I would ask you and Lee, why do we want to cast stones at Joseph Smith or the church leaders today when Paul says, I lie, yes, for the glory of God? Why do you judge me as a terrible sinner?
What reference was that again? I just wanted to look at it. Romans
chapter 3.
7, he said.
Okay.
I think it's 7.
Thank you.
In other words, and it goes along with the Savior's statement, be wise as serpents, harmless as doves. All the way through the Bible, there are references, as I said before, of lying being a necessary evil, perhaps a means to an end. Okay.
So what you're saying is that it's okay for the church to lie. It's okay for Joseph Smith.
I'm not saying it's okay. I'm just saying I don't want to throw out my Bible. I don't want to throw out Joseph Smith, and I don't want to be a hypocrite.
Okay.
All right.
Would you consider that statement of the church saying that they do not practice polygamy a lie?
I don't know that I would describe it as a lie. It might be misinformation, but again, do you agree that Paul lied for the glory of God?
That's new to me. That's absolutely new to me.
Yeah. Yeah, it might be the interpretation of that. We would have to check that out. So if anybody is going to that scripture, I always advise go like 20 scriptures before, 20 scriptures after, and see if that's actually what he's saying.
Go for the Greek.
So, but let's go to the next question. Is
I'm good.
You're
that
good?
Was it. It was
Okay.
those questions.
Those are the questions? Okay.
Yeah.
So obviously you see the differences between a biblical Christian, Lee Baker, and also Alan, a very devout believer in Joseph Smith and his understanding of it. I'm sure it was a very worthwhile viewing of seeing these differences. Thanks for watching. Appreciate you guys. And if you have any questions, comment below.